Hi, I wanted to talk a little bit about the synthesis essay. I've gotten a lot of questions about the essay and what exactly you're trying to do with the essay, how to proceed with it, what it should look like when you're done, what all the different sections are for. So I wanted to take a few minutes and try to answer some of those questions. If after looking at this you're still uncertain about how to proceed, please drop me an email, come to my online office hours next Wednesday. There are a lot of different resources that we can use to help you feel comfortable with this essay. So first, I want to talk about kind of the point of the synthesis essay. You can see from the prompt itself, this is taken directly from the assignment. Write a 5 to 6 page thesis-driven synthesis essay in which you incorporate your own independent thinking with 2 of the following texts. And then, of course, in the assignment, it lists those texts. So you've all chosen those 2 texts. You've written a synthesis question. The whole point of that synthesis question is to give you something to engage with, something to respond to, something for the individual essays that you've chosen to respond to as you write. When it talks about your own independent thinking, the point there is that you should be making an argument. You should have something to say. You should be making specific claims and assertions that you then use the texts to back up what you're saying, to show where you diverge from what a given text is saying, to interact with the texts as you develop your own argument. So let's look a little bit at each of the sections of the essay and what they should do. And I do pull some things from that student sample essay. If you haven't read that, in particular, if you are confused about the assignment, I think reading the student sample essay is a very good and helpful way to begin. I don't think the student sample is perfect. I don't think it's necessarily the 100% correct and only way to organize and develop this essay, but especially if you are uncertain, it's going to help you understand what the essay should look like, what you're trying to do with the essay, and sets up, I think, a fine structure that you would be welcome to replicate as you organize your own essay. So let's start with the introduction section. So we know from just general from your life experience as a writer, certainly from the rhetorical analysis essay, that your introduction should give context to what you're doing in your essay, should state your thesis, should basically set up everything that you need to do in your paper. I'm going to look at this. This is the entire introductory paragraph from the student sample essay, and I have highlighted a couple things on it. You notice that there are 2 things in bold. So we'll talk about both of those things. But first, I want you to look at this beginning part. The student opens up by giving kind of a scenario that is relatable to a general audience. It develops the context for the topic that the student is addressing. And after she goes through and kind of introduces the topic, she actually writes her synthesis question. Why do people need to think individually? So I wouldn't say that you have to post your synthesis question, or excuse me, include your synthesis question as part of your introduction, but it can be a good way to kind of frame the argument. One thing to keep in mind for sure is that the synthesis question is not your thesis. Your thesis is your answer to the synthesis question. And that is a very important distinction to make. The question is not the thesis. After she writes her synthesis question, you see that she goes through and introduces both of the texts that she'll be working with. So in this case, she does Propaganda Under a Dictatorship and Diagnosing and Treating the Ophelia Syndrome. That's also important to do in your introduction because it again gives context. So far we've seen 3 things that the student has done. She's opened it with kind of an attention getter, a way to kind of grab the audience, to build common ground, all that stuff that you kind of want an introduction to do. She posts her synthesis question, includes her synthesis question. She introduces both of the texts that she'll be using in her essay. And then finally, well, excuse me, not finally, before she does her thesis, she talks about how they address that question, the synthesis question, that they both are different, but they have some overlap and that they answer it in this certain way. So you may not be able to say, based on your question and what you're doing, that both of your texts respond in the same way to your question, which is fine, but that's the way that she's done it. And then finally, in that second bold blue section, that is her thesis. Examining these essays leads to the discovery of 3 benefits of thinking individually. Independent thinkers cannot be controlled by people or trends. Independent thinkers never blindly follow the crowd, and independent thinkers learn when to accept limits. And you are going to see these 3 concepts come up again in the synthesis section of the essay. So what the student is setting up in her thesis, again, is the independent thinking that we saw in the assignment prompt. The thesis is her argument, what she wants to say about, in response to this topic about independent thinkers. So again, that's going to come back. You do not, in a thesis, have to include 3 things that you want to talk about. But again, especially if you're struggling with organization and how to proceed with the paper, sometimes listing 2 or 3 or 4 things in the thesis specifically can be a good way to help you understand how you want to organize your paper and to help your readers see what you'll be doing as well. Now, the summary section is not going to respond to the thesis at all. What it does is provide context for your reader about what you're talking about. You want to assume that your reader is going to be familiar enough with the concepts that you're talking about that you won't necessarily have to define what independent thinking is. You won't have to do that. But you also want to assume that they may not be familiar with the essays that you're synthesizing. And so to provide summary of those is helpful to the reader. It gives context and clarity to the project that you're doing in this essay. So I have not too much to say about summary other than that you should include summaries of both of the texts. And you see that in the student sample as well. The analysis section. Now this is where I think when we look about what's the difference between the analysis section and the synthesis section, I think there are a couple different ways you can think about this. One way that I like to think about it is this, that the analysis section has a job to do. When we think about writing, every part of your essay, whatever essay you're writing, has a specific job to do. The job of the thesis is to tell your reader what you'll be doing in your essay, what the main idea, what the point of your essay is. The introduction has a job to do. The conclusion has a job to do. So in this particular essay, with the way that the prompt is set up, the job of the analysis section, as I see it, is to answer these questions. How would each of these texts answer my synthesis question? Okay, so based on the text themselves, not your own thinking, not your own argument, how would these essays that you have read, how would these sources, these texts, how do they answer the synthesis question? And then also I've included the question, how do these texts talk to each other? So if you think about what you did in lesson 20, this is what we're kind of the basic project that lesson 20 is trying to get at, that you want to show how they compare and contrast, how they talk to each other, and then also how they answer that synthesis question. Okay, now the difference, well, here I've included a section here. She doesn't show a lot of engagement in the sample of how they interact. We do see this one key phrase here, like Huxley, so we see that as a comparison. But the way that she set it up, those sections are pretty separate. They do not have to be. You can do them together, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to move on to the synthesis section and how it's different from the analysis section. So if we take the analysis section as being where you show how the text that you're using would answer your synthesis question, the synthesis section answers the question, how do I, as the writer, how do I answer the synthesis question? How do the texts either agree with or diverge from my own perspective? You do not have to agree with the basic premises of the essays that you've read in order to do synthesis. They don't have to agree with your own independent thinking, with your own argument, but you do have to use them. So sometimes when we do synthesis, we show how a well-respected author agrees with us, and that's good. Sometimes we show how a given text that we disagree with, and so you would bring in quotations or examples from that text and then say, although this particular author believes fill in the blank, I actually think, or you wouldn't necessarily have to say I, but that's the basic balance that you would show. So you don't have to agree with everything you've read. You can show how you diverge from those texts. But that's what we're trying to answer. Instead of how do these essays, how would they answer the question? This is where you say, how would I answer it? This is where you make your argument. So if we look at the student sample essay, I have her thesis here at the top, which we went over earlier, and then I have the topic sentences of each of her 3 body paragraphs. Again, there's nothing magical about the number 3, but it is a clear way to set it up, and it's certainly how she set up her synthesis section in her essay. So let's compare that first element of her thesis essay, independent thinkers cannot be controlled by people or trends, and we see that here. Independent thinkers have developed critical thinking skills and have come to understand their inner voice and private thoughts. That matches that. The second point here, independent thinkers never blindly follow the crowd. Synthesis body 2. Independent thinkers will never blindly follow the crowd when contemplating the issues that face the world. And then finally, independent thinkers will learn when to accept limits, and we see that topic sentence. Independent thinkers learn when to accept limits imposed by those in positions of power. So there's a very clear match. Each of those body paragraphs in the synthesis section has a very specific task that is clearly communicated to the reader through a topic sentence, and the organization of it works really well. But again, these are the writer's assertions. She wants to assert this idea about critical thinking, and she wants to assert the idea of not blindly following the crowd, and she wants to assert the idea about that sometimes it is important for an independent thinker to accept limitations and impositions from people in power. So we see all of these things working together, and again, this is synthesis. It's different from the analysis because this is what the writer herself is arguing that independent thinking is. And then if you go back and look at her draft, at her essay, you'll see how everything that she pulls in from the text is in service of the points that she is making in each of these 3 sentences that you see here. Now I want to talk a little bit, I mentioned this before, but these are 2 possibilities of how to organize the essay. So possibility 1, that's how the student sample is organized. There's the introduction and the thesis, then she summarizes source A, then she analyzes source A, then she summarizes source B, then she analyzes source B, then she does a synthesis, and then she does the conclusion. That is a fine way to do it. She's written a successful essay, it works, but it's not the only way to organize it. So I've given another option, and again, there may be more options, but if you look at possibility 2, still start with the introduction and thesis and close with the conclusion, because that's what you always do. You have to start somewhere and you have to end somewhere, so those will never change. But in possibility 2, you summarize A and then you summarize B, so the summaries are juxtaposed right next to each other in your essay, and then you analyze A and you analyze B. And again, if you set up your analysis to have them both analyzed in the same section of your paper, and by same section I don't mean same paragraph, just in the same section, then that is closer to what lesson 20 asked you to do in terms of comparison and contrast, and it just allows everything to be focused together. So this is how both of them work together rather than going back and forth. And then of course still the synthesis and the conclusion. All right, I hope that that clarifies what you're trying to do with this essay. But if you still have questions, you of course always can ask me. I'm happy to answer questions. You should never feel like, oh, she's probably answered this question a dozen times. It doesn't really matter. I'm happy to answer your question even if I've answered it a dozen times. The more people who ask me questions, then I start understanding kind of what everybody's facing, how to be more helpful to the group at large, which is what prompted me to make the screencast in the first place. With your peers, on your discussion boards, ask specific questions. Say things like, I'm really stuck. I can't figure out how to answer this question with my second source. Do you have any insight? You could say, I think this is too short. How could I develop this further? Be specific. And then finally, there's the link to the Writing Center. I really hope this has been helpful. Please contact me with any questions, and truly, good luck.